The winter of the northern frontier had a way of stripping a man down to his bones, not just of warmth but of certainty, and Eli Turner had learned that truth the hard way after 15 years, alone in a timber cabin, wedged between pine forest and frozen creek, a place the maps barely bothered to name and the wind never forgot to punish. And on the third night of a blizzard that screamed like a living thing, outside his walls, he heard something that was not wind, not wood cracking, not the wolves that sometimes prowled too close, but a sound raw and human, a broken cry that cut through the storm and settled in his chest like a blade, forcing him from his chair. Despite every instinct warning him that winter mercy often came wrapped in death, and when he pulled open the cabin door, snow blasted inside and nearly knocked him back. Yet there they were, collapsed near the steps, two women barely more than shadows beneath ice and frost, their dark hair stiff with snow, their clothes torn and soaked, their skin pale with cold but unmistakably Apache. And for a long moment Eli stood frozen, knowing exactly what this meant, knowing the history of blood and fear between settlers and the Apache, knowing that helping them could mean his own end, yet knowing too that if he turned away now, they would not survive the night. And something deeper than fear moved him then, something older than the frontier itself, and he dragged them inside one by one, bolting the door against the storm, laying them by the fire, stripping off frozen garments with shaking hands, rubbing life back into limbs that barely responded, speaking softly though he knew they could not hear him, telling them to hold on, to breathe, to stay. And by dawn the storm had passed, but the consequences had only begun. Because when the women finally woke, eyes dark and sharp despite weakness, they did not scream or beg. They studied him with the caution of those who had seen too much cruelty to assume kindness, and Eli introduced himself slowly, carefully offering water and broth, explaining in broken trade words that he meant no harm, that the storm would have killed them, that they were safe for now. And the older of the two, who called herself Nanton, nodded once with a strength that surprised him, while the younger Ishta stared at the cabin walls as if expecting them to close in. And over the next 3 days, as the women regained strength, the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken truths, because Eli learned in fragments that they had fled a raiding party, that their people believed them dead, that returning now would bring punishment or worse. And the women learned that Eli lived alone not because he preferred it but because the frontier had taken his family years ago and left him with scars he did not speak of. And in those days something fragile formed in that cabin. Not romance, not yet, but trust earned through shared fire and shared food, through watching the horizon together and listening for danger, yet danger was already moving. Because word travels fast among the Apache, especially when two women vanish in a storm and tracks lead toward forbidden's land. And on the morning of the 4th day, Eli woke to a silence deeper than snow, the birds gone, the forest holding its breath. And when he stepped outside, rifle in hand, his heart sank as he saw them, 30 Apache warriors encircling the clearing, faces painted, weapons ready, eyes fixed on his cabin like a judgment already passed. And at their head stood a chief whose gaze was not wild but coldly deliberate, a man who raised his hand and spoke in a voice that carried without shouting, telling Eli that he had sheltered Apache women, that this act could be kindness or theft depending on what followed, that Apache law demanded balance. And Eli felt the weight of the moment crush him, because the women stepped out beside him then, standing tall despite fear, and the chief declared the terms that would decide whether the cabin would stand or burn, whether Eli would live or die, whether mercy would be answered with blood. And the words fell like iron into the snow, that to shelter Apache women was to claim responsibility for them, that responsibility must be sealed by marriage. And Eli's breath caught as the chief finished, saying that Eli must choose to marry one or both, or face the consequences of refusal. And the forest seemed to lean closer, the warriors tightening their circle, the women staring at Eli with expressions that held fear, hope, and something unspoken. And in that moment, Eli understood that the storm he had braved was nothing compared to the choice before him, a choice that would bind lives, ignite conflict, and change the course of every soul standing in that frozen clearing. And as the wind stirred the snow and the chief waited for an answer, the story paused on the edge of fate, asking the viewer silently whether one act of compassion could truly rewrite destiny. And if you want to know what choice Eli makes, what price love and honor demand, and how this standoff explodes into loyalty, sacrifice, and an ending no one sees coming, then stay with this story, because Chapter 2 reveals everything. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, and keep you listening until the last breath, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the frontier holds many more tales where one decision changes everything. The circle of warriors held steady as time seemed to slow to a painful crawl, and Eli felt the weight of 30 lives pressing against his chest while the women beside him stood unmoving, their shoulders squared not in defiance but in acceptance of a law older than the snow beneath their feet. And when he finally spoke, his voice surprised even himself by how calm it sounded, telling the chief that he would not choose between lives as though they were burdens to be traded, that he would take responsibility for both women if responsibility was the price of mercy. A murmur rippled through the warriors like wind through dry grass, surprise mixed with approval and suspicion, and the chief studied Eli for a long moment before nodding once, declaring that courage carried weight among the Apache, and that the Union would be recognized. But that recognition did not mean safety, because other tribes, other settlers, and even members of his own people would see this act as provocation. And from that day forward, Eli's cabin would no longer be invisible to the world. And the following weeks proved him right, as the land itself seemed to test the fragile peace that had been forged, because Nanton and Ishta did not suddenly become symbols of romance or comfort, but living bridges between two worlds that distrusted each other deeply. And Eli learned that love in such a place was not spoken softly by firelight, but hammered into shape through shared labor, shared danger, and shared loss. As whispers spread among nearby settlements that Eli had gone native, that he had invited savagery into the valley, and not long after those whispers turned into threats, when a band of armed men rode in, one dawn with hatred in their eyes and torches in their hands, demanding that Eli hand over the women or face the consequences. And it was then that the true meaning of his choice revealed itself, because before Eli could even answer, Apache riders emerged from the tree line, bows drawn, rifles leveled, not attacking but standing firm beside the cabin. Warriors who had sworn to protect the Union they themselves had demanded. And the standoff ended not in blood but in retreat, the settlers realizing too late that the frontier no longer obeyed simple lines of ownership. And seasons passed, harsh and unforgiving, yet the cabin endured, expanding into something more than shelter as Apache children laughed where gunfire once echoed, as trade replaced raids, as Eli learned the language of the people he had once feared, and as Nanton and Ishta grew not as rivals, but as partners bound by survival and respect, teaching Eli that love was not divided by sharing, but strengthened by it. Though peace was never complete, and tragedy never far, because one winter brought sickness, another brought fire, and each trial demanded sacrifice that tested their bond, until finally the chief returned years later, older and slower, to sit by Eli's hearth and admit that what began as a demand had become an example, that mercy backed by courage could bend even the hardest traditions. And as the fire cracked and snow fell softly outside, Eli understood that the storm, which had nearly killed 2 women, had instead given birth to a family, a fragile alliance, and a legacy written not in treaties or blood but in choice. And as this story closes, remember that every great turning point begins with a single act of compassion in the cold. And if stories of survival, honor, and impossible decisions keep you listening to the end, don't let this be the last one you hear. Subscribe to the channel, because many more powerful frontier tales are waiting to be told.
Subscribe to my channel.